So this is the 6th video in my series, in my A to Z series, about words which can expand your vocabulary in English, but which can also tell us something about the English language. Now today I've got my mobile with me. It's actually quite a cheap mobile because I couldn't justify the expense of buying something like an iPhone. Now this phone works fine. I can watch YouTube on it, I can connect it to all the social media platforms, and it's got a camera on it. But I imagine if I had an iPhone, it would do all of those things just that little bit better. The pictures would be better, the screen would be sharper, and overall I imagine it's got a quicker processor and it would just feel a little bit more snappy to use. Now there's a word we can use to describe all of the things that a device like this does. F is for functionality. F is for functionality. I think there's no better place to start than with a definition. Functionality, noun, the quality of being functional, the set of functions that something can perform. So functionality means everything that a thing can do. Let's take a look at a couple of synonyms, words that have a similar meaning, and there's a couple of close ones in the English language. We've got capability and we've got performance. So I could talk not only about the functionality of my phone, but I could talk about its overall performance or its capability. But let's take a closer look at the word functionality in the context of a couple of sentences. Most people can use a phone for years without discovering its full functionality. So what we're saying here is that people can use a phone without discovering, without finding out everything that it's capable of. Because I think most of us, myself included, only tend to use 2 or 3 apps on their phone most of the time. So most people can use a phone for years without discovering its full functionality. Of course, people want a cool-looking gadget, but not at the expense of functionality. Now, a gadget is any electronic device, be that a phone, a camera, or an audio player. And we can use the word gadget, or gizmo even. And here what we're saying is that although people want something that looks nice, that's got good aesthetics, what they really want is something that functions, something that works. Of course, people want a cool-looking gadget, but not at the expense of functionality. Now I want to talk about the word functionality in the context of 2 other words. Firstly, a noun, the noun function, and the adjective functional. And I think it's going to be easier to do this by taking a look at some example sentences which use each of these words. And I'm going to start with the noun function. If there's one key function that every decent smartphone must have, it's the ability to take a good photo. So the word function, the noun function, simply refers to something that a thing can do. So at its most basic level, the function of a car is to take you from one place to another, or from A to B, as we say in English. That's a function. If there's one key function that every decent smartphone must have, it's the ability to take a good photo. So we can take the noun function and add the suffix al and get the adjective functional. Let's take a look at it. There's not much functional difference between Apple and Android phones. Now here, we're not talking about what they look like or the design choices that the 2 styles of phones have. Rather, we're talking about what they actually do. There's not much functional difference between Apple and Android phones. Now there's a second way we can use the adjective functional, and it's one that I quite like. Take a look at this line. This style of architecture can best be described as functional. And in this context, when we're talking about something being functional, we're saying that it does what it is supposed to do, but absolutely no more than that. So looking at this design of house, it's got 4 walls and a roof, but it's very hard to imagine any architecture being any more basic than that. So we describe it as being functional. This style of architecture can best be described as functional. And this in turn brings us back to our word of today, functionality. The overall functionality of a modern phone is such that computer sales have fallen dramatically. So when we talk about functionality, we're not talking about a single function. The fact, for example, that a modern telephone has a camera on it. We're talking about its entire feature set. That's its functionality. So that's the distinction between the two nouns. The overall functionality of a modern phone is such that computer sales have fallen dramatically. Of course, it's not just function, functional, and functionality that have this relationship of noun, adjective, and second noun in the English language. There are loads of other examples that follow exactly the same pattern. And here's a few that I've picked out. We've got nation, norm, origin, universe, and tone. So if we just take the example of origin, for example, which means the source of something, we can derive the adjective, original, which means something that hasn't been seen before, and from there the second noun, originality, which means the state of being original. So I could say of Quentin Tarantino, the film director, that although you may not appreciate all of his movies, his originality cannot be questioned. All of which brings us on to the subject of nominalization. What, you say? What the hell is nominalization? Nominalization, the creation of nouns from either verbs or adjectives, of which the words functionality and originality are examples. Now, the problem with these words is that they tend to be quite complicated. They also tend to be created by people like academics in universities, by lawyers, and by people in the world of business. And whilst these words can be used freely and they're in the dictionary, often there are much easier ways in which we can express ourselves rather than using them. It's probably going to be easier for me to explain this by giving you a couple of examples. The expansion of the metal, the causation being the hot weather, resulted in the distortion of the tracks and the derailment of the train. Now, I think we can all agree that is one ugly sentence. It's hard to understand and it's very complicated. And it's because it includes 4 nouns that are themselves the results of the process of nominalization. Expansion, causation, distortion, and derailment. Now, these are all quite complicated nouns that have all been constructed originally out of verbs. Now, we can express ourselves much more clearly if we just turn all of those nouns into verbs and say something like this instead. The hot weather caused the metal to expand, distorting the tracks and derailing the train. Now, we've taken about 1/3 the number of words out of the sentence. It means exactly the same, and it's significantly easier to understand. And that's because we're using verbs rather than complicated nouns. Let's take a look at one more example. The argumentation of the defence team was that their client had no knowledge of IT security and that his participation in the crime could not have been possible. And once again, I've underlined 3 nouns that we can simplify by turning them into verbs, and they're argumentation, knowledge, and participation. So we can simplify the whole thing by saying the defence team argued that their client knew nothing about IT security and that he couldn't have participated in the crime. Again, it's much easier to understand. The defence team argued that their client knew nothing about IT security and that he couldn't have participated in the crime. So F was for functionality, a word that you'll hear quite often in the English language. But the word functionality also carries a warning for us, and that's that these nouns that have been created out of either adjectives or verbs often overcomplicate our language. Sometimes using them makes it more difficult for us to express ourselves clearly and concisely. So you could go into a mobile phone shop and say, "Could you please describe the functionality of this phone?" Or you could simply say, "What does it do?" Until next time.